Hello, and welcome to Lawless Conversations with Katie. I'm Katie, your host. This podcast goes through various difficult subjects such as abortion, gun control, prison systems, or gender, to name a few, and dives into all different aspects of the arguments that might be offered or discussed. At the moment, we are wading our way through the subject of abortion. Today, we are on the second part of the conception argument, which is space exploration. Although I have spent a lot of time and effort into researching these topics, I am by no means an expert on this subject or any other subject I will explore in the future. So take my thoughts with a grain of salt, and of course, if you have any questions or things to add, please share them. I try my best to keep my own biases out of these explorations, and because I am talking about many aspects of a subject, including opposing ideas and arguments, know that these are not necessarily ideas that I subscribe to or hold personally. I will, however, explore different arguments as if I do believe in them in order to truly explore all facets of this subject. Finally, because these are difficult subjects, there will be some content that is hard to hear and might be triggering. Please understand I am not looking to insult anyone, but to explore these subjects openly and honestly. I don't want to convince anyone to think like me. I want to convince people to think, period. So without further ado, come have a lawless conversation with me. This is the second part of the conception argument, and it is very short, but I did feel like it was important to separate it because it's a whole different set of discussions, but a very interesting one that was brought to my attention and I quite enjoyed exploring. And that would be the idea of space exploration as it pertains to an embryo and the life that is created when the sperm meets the egg. In our exploration of the universe and space, there is constantly a search for proof that life might have existed in some way on other planets. Thus, when molecules or bacteria are found on another planet, scientists will label it as life, or the proof of the possible existence of life that they were looking for. For many who argue conception, if bacteria on Mars can be considered life, how much more should we consider an embryo in a mother's uterus? To say that the moment of fertilization creates a being that must be protected opens up the field eventually into belief. For instance, if the argument has been made that finding bacteria on Mars equates life, and thus an embryo is life as well, bacteria must also be protected because, like an embryo, it is a living thing inside the body. The use of antibiotics would then come into ethical question. Most people who hold to this concept would retort that bacteria is not a living thing, like an embryo or fetus is. Here the argument breaks down a little bit. By this thinking, there is now a higher value placed on the life of an embryo because it will one day be born into a human. This then places the value of life into different categories. A human life is worth protecting, but other forms of life are not. The question then comes into play whether laws should be made on thought processes like this. Because we are no longer looking at life from a scientific point of view, but through a belief that certain life is worth protecting, laws would be made based on belief. Naturally, one would then have to assume that everyone believes or is forced to believe the same thing. With this element of the conception argument, it doesn't take away the fact of the embryo being alive from the moment of fertilization, but it does bring up an interesting element of the conception argument because it is often based in a religious connotation of what life is as opposed to a scientific connotation. However, those who are not religious might still see it as life, but it is still not choosing to adhere to a scientific idea of what life is, or it's putting life into different categories of value, which is, whether religion-based or not, is still an interesting concept of if we are placing different life in different sets of worthiness of being alive or different value sets, then it comes into a whole different set of discussions of what is life and why would life be set into different values, and who gets to decide which life is valued over others? Who gets to decide if antibiotics are something that can be used because bacteria is life? It just opens this field up to a whole different set of discussions and ideas that I found rather interesting. I don't have an answer, but it was still an interesting concept. For the questions for this section, if a line of life can be drawn, should we place different forms of life into different categories? If so, why? And on top of that, do you think these categories should be drawn from a personal belief or a religious belief or a scientific belief? Second, what kind of categories should we create if we are going to put life into different categories? If you are interested in commenting about this episode or answering any of the questions I just asked, you are welcome to. You can either send me an email at lawlessconversations@yahoo.com. That is LAWLESSCONVERSATIONS@yahoo.com. You can also comment on Twitter at Lawless Convos, LAWLESSCONVOS. Finally, you can also contact me on Facebook if you just look for Lawless Conversations, 2 different words, LAWLESSCONVERSATIONS. I look forward to hearing from you. The references to any sources that I use in each episode will be available in the bio, along with all of these social media connections. Join me on Sunday as I look at a paper that discusses various research papers and studies in relation to the need to save parasites. I found this in my research, and it was quite interesting and pertains to this subject particularly. Thank you for joining me for this episode. I look forward to Sunday.